day, some parents brought their little children to Jesus so he could touch and bless them. But when the disciples saw this, they scolded the parents for bothering him. Then Jesus called for the children and said to the disciples, "Let the children come to me. Don't stop them, for the kingdom of God belongs to those who are like these children. I tell you the truth, anyone who doesn't receive the kingdom of God like a child will never enter it."
Hey, good morning, everybody. It's good to see you all. I've been gone the last couple of Sundays. We were on vacation, so it's nice to be back. See everyone. I was going to wear white this morning, but I thought, with a newly minted tan, white is just rubbing it in people's faces. So I went blue instead to mute it just a bit. Anyway, okay. I'm starting a new series this morning that I'm calling The Big Three. Here's the idea behind this. This is like a meta series. So this is going to take about 12 weeks that we'll sort of break up over the rest of the summer and into the early fall, so it won't feel monotonous. But the basic idea here is that human beings, we're not just animals. We are unique creatures in the sense that we're not just interested in quantity of life. We're not content with survival and reproduction, right? We want quality of life. We want our lives to mean something. We want to feel them as having substance. We use words like fulfillment. The ancients would use the phrase eudaimonia. It meant well-being or flourishing. Jesus would say, "I came to give them full and abundant life," right? We want our lives to have quality to them. In order for our lives to have a kind of quality, for us to feel like they're flourishing, we have to make meaning of them, which is another unique human capacity. We need our existence to be understandable to us. And the process of making meaning is, if you sort of boil it down, it is a process of asking, and more importantly, finding satisfactory answers for really big questions. Questions that are so big and so central to what it means to be human that we often don't realize we're even asking them. We just get up every day and we go scurrying about in the world, doing what we do, in many ways, to answer these questions. That we don't realize a lot of our activity is in pursuit of answering these questions, or how we live our lives is a reflection of how we've already answered them, whether we realize we've answered them or not. So what we're going to do in this series is we're going to name three of the largest and most common that are connected to human flourishing. I'm going to roll them out one at a time to keep suspense. So I'm only going to roll out one today, and we'll spend the next 4 weeks talking about that, and then the next one, and then the next one, right? So that you don't get bored. And I should say that the questions that we're going to talk about that are behind each one of these doors, they're connected. We're going to distinguish them for the sake of being able to talk about them and for some clarity, but you can't separate them. In many ways, this is like three angles on the same topic. They are all interconnected, and I will make those connections and point that out as we go along. Okay, ready for question number one? No drum roll needed. The question that we're gonna begin talking about this morning, that's going to occupy the next 4 weeks, is the question of identity. The question is, who am I? Who am I? Okay, unlike any other animal creature, human beings are self-reflective. That is, we have the capacity for self-image or self-concept. We don't just think, we think about ourselves. Some of us too much. We think about ourselves thinking about ourselves. Some of us too much. We have the capacity for self-image, and our experience tells us that in order to flourish, we need a stable, healthy, secure, deeply satisfying sense of self. We have to know who we are, and we have to like what we know. And we spend a lot of time and energy and money and resources on this project. We leaned into demographic categories to help us form and frame our identity. Things like race and ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, education level, age, right? I am a white, middle class, cisgendered, heterosexual, husband of Carrie, father of 3 who serves as a pastor. We create temperamental categories. I am choleric. You're melancholy. We create personality types. I am an INFJ, 8-wing 7 golden retriever, right? I am not. If you know that test, I am not a golden retriever. I am definitely a lion, okay? But we create categories like that. We think of our identity in terms of our interests. I am a scrapbooker. I'm a fisherman. I do CrossFit. I homeschool. I wear leather pants. Whatever the stuff is that you do, we buy things. We buy things as a way of curating a sense of self. You bought a Jeep because you think of yourself as a Jeep girl. And I bought a truck because I think of myself as a truck man. Why did I have my parents buy me a pair of David Robinson basketball shoes when I was in junior high? Not because they were helpful. They were like 15 pounds. It was like playing basketball in cinder blocks. And as a junior high kid, I was slow enough. I did not need the help. But I wanted the shoes because I was curating an identity. It was a way of expressing who I was or who I thought I was or who I wanted to be. And this is why a lot of us parents, especially as our kids get a little older and into the adolescent years, we get them involved in a ton of activities because whether we realize we're doing it or not, we're trying to help them find their thing. Because we think if they find their thing, they'll find themselves. Like it's a discovery process. We spend a lot of time and energy. I bet some of you have even sent a blood sample to a for-profit company for like DNA genealogical analysis. Why would anyone do that? Well, because we think that the information we're going to get back is going to tell us about where we're from. And, like you might find out you have a family member you didn't know about, or someone in your family's a serial killer. That happens. So watch out. But it's a search for story. We think that by gathering the information, it's going to tell us something about where we come from, which in turn is going to tell us something about ourselves. It is a search for story in an effort to form and frame personal identity. This is now a commercial enterprise today. Influencers literally make money just being themselves and trying to get you to be more like them. We pay them for this, or somebody does. I don't, but somebody pays them. We spend a lot of time and money and energy and effort around the question, who am I? Because we spend so much time, effort, energy, and money on this question, obviously tells us that it's important. We know it's important. The fact that we have to spend so much time, energy, effort, and money on answering this question also should suggest to us that it's a rather difficult question to answer. For as important as it is, it would seem it is also frustratingly elusive for a lot of people. And not just for young people. I think it's pretty easy to see with young people because they're in the early stages of kind of identity formation and figuring out who they're going to be in the world. And of course, living in a world now of digital technology and social media makes everything so complicated. But it's also an adult thing. It's not just a youth thing. Just when you thought you had the identity question nailed down, you were pretty confident that you knew who you were or who I am, something happens in your life that thrusts that question back into your face. You lose a job, your marriage fails, or maybe you just retire. Your kids move out of the house. You just are getting older, and you just can't do the things that you used to do. And you find yourself in a private moment asking the question, who am I really? It's a huge question at the center of human flourishing. But it is a very difficult question for a lot of modern Western people to answer. It is one that we wrestle with most of our lives. Some of you are here this morning and you are currently wrestling with this question. Who am I? Now, I want to talk this morning about a couple of reasons why I think this is such a struggle for us in our culture. Because one of the things I want you to know is that it has not always been this way. Some of the greatest minds in Western culture spent a lot of time reflecting on the topic of the self, and they never wrote about something we call identity crisis. Like that was a phrase that would have been incoherent to them. But we use it all the time, almost secondhand. The idea that people will struggle to know who they are, and that struggle to know who they are will create real existential problems for them, is in many ways a unique phenomenon. It's unique to us. And so I want to talk about what's going on in our world that makes knowing who we are so much more challenging than it once was. Now, I'm going to give you two reasons. I'm sure there are more. I'm going to talk about two reasons. The first, I'm going to talk about less because it's easier to get your minds around, and it's almost like a truism. I'm going to say it, and you're going to go, yeah, that's obviously true. The second one, I'm going to spend more time on because it's a little more subtle, but it's everywhere, and it's the kind of thing that you could spend your whole life and just because of the pace of life, never take a step back to even recognize that it's there. Okay, so the first one of the reasons I think we struggle in contemporary Western culture with identity, with answering this question, who am I, is because our identities, our sense of self, is rooted or anchored in a lot of different, I'm going to call them ephemeral categories. Categories outside of ourselves that are by nature come and go. They're not permanent. So when I think of myself in terms of categories like I am a spouse, I am a father, I am a pastor, I am a whatever, fill in the blank. And while I hope those categories, many of them don't change for the rest of my life, many of these categories will. How do I think of myself if tomorrow I'm no longer a pastor? Some of you have had this experience. You thought of yourselves as performing a certain social role, and then that social role changed. And it spiraled you into a, who am I now? God forbid something should ever happen to my marriage or my kids. How do I think of myself if tomorrow I'm not a spouse anymore? Or I'm not a father anymore? So one of the reasons I think we struggle, and I'm going to use the phrase unstable, the word unstable. I'm going to use that word over and over again this morning. One of the reasons I think identity is unstable for a lot of people in contemporary Western culture is because it is rooted and anchored in categories outside of ourself that by definition are transitory. They come and go. And so when that is the case, when your sense of self is rooted in a category that is not permanent, then when that category comes and then goes, you are going to experience some kind of existential crisis. You're going to struggle with a sense of who you are. Now, most of you are probably going to hear me say that and go, yeah, that seems to make sense. And you probably have had experiences where that has happened. Now, I want to say, because this is important, we're going to circle back around to this. Looking outside of yourself for categories in order to create a sense of identity is not only entirely appropriate, it is necessary. It is a must. So the fact that I look to categories like my occupation, or the fact that I'm a spouse or a father or so forth and so on, the fact that I look to those categories to give me a sense of myself is not bad. It is not wrong. It is good. It is necessary. One of the points I want to make this morning is you cannot form a healthy, stable, secure, coherent sense of self without looking outside of yourself. The problem that a lot of us run into is that our sense of self is rooted in categories outside of the self that are not permanent. They are essentially ephemeral, and that's what makes them unstable for us to build identity. So one of the reasons we struggle is because we anchor our identity in categories that are not ultimately trustworthy, is one way to think about that. And that creates an unstable identity reality for us. They go, and then we don't know who we are anymore. The other side of this conversation, and this is the one that I think is harder to see, but it's more important for us to get our minds around, is not that we anchor our identity in categories outside of ourselves that are not permanent. It's that we don't anchor our identity in any categories outside of ourselves at all. So if the problem that or the mistake we make on the one side is I think of myself in relation to these things that I do in the world or my roles in the world, and those things can come and go, and that creates a problem. The other mistake that we make is thinking that we don't need any of those categories at all. So another way to think about this is I get to decide for myself who I am, irrespective of any categories outside of myself. So who I am, this is another way to say this, who I am is not a social phenomenon. It's not a physical phenomenon. It's not a material phenomenon. It is an internal psychological phenomenon. I determine who I am, and the way that I determine who I am is by looking inside of myself, not by looking to any categories outside of myself. And if you hear that, even to be able to articulate that is evidence that we live in a wildly different world than people have ever lived in before. It's what Philip Reif calls a third world. In first and second worlds, one way to think about a culture, a society, a group of people, is based on how they mutually agree on permissions and prohibitions. What's okay and what's taboo, what's licit and what's illicit. So a group of people say X is okay, this group over here says X is not okay. That's one way to distinguish one society from another. Another layer to that distinction is not just what they say is okay and not okay, but how they justify it. Why is it okay? Why is it not okay? And historically speaking, almost every culture in human history has justified their shared life together by referring to some real or perceived sacred authority outside of themselves. So if you asked an ancient Greek why they were allowed, if you could sit down with the founder of ancient Greek society and say, well, hey, why are Greeks allowed to do A and not allowed to do B? He would say, because the oracle at Delphi says so. If you were to talk to a person in medieval Europe and say, well, why are you not allowed to kill people? That person would say, because God says so. This is what Reif calls first and second worlds. The way that you justify your existence and your shared life together is you're referring to some authority outside of yourself for justification. The world that you and I live in, contemporary Western culture, is what Reif calls a third world. And what that means is that we don't refer to a sacred authority anymore to justify ourselves. We are entirely self-referential or self-justifying. What is right or wrong to us in our world is not because God says so. Language like that is incomprehensible in the world that you and I live in. It's crazy talk. You can't sit in any room, not even in rooms with other professing Christians, and say because God says so. Today, there is an authority that is internal and it's psychological. A thing is right or wrong not because a sacred external authority says so, but because I say so. And I say so because of how I perceive it or how it makes me feel. It is totally normal in our world for someone to say this is right or wrong because of how I perceive it to be. And that's all the further the conversation has to go. Right or wrong, I just want you to know that's unique. That's never been done before. In the history of certainly of Western culture, we are living in an unprecedented moment where when it comes to justifying our shared life together, we no longer refer to a sacred authority outside of ourselves. The only authority that matters in our lives is the inner voice. And listen, I talked to you a few weeks ago about the conscience and how important the conscience is. This turn inward is not all bad. So I don't want you to think that I'm saying this should not happen. Our inner self it's an important aspect of who we are. Partly because it allows us to challenge and critically engage the kind of social customs and norms and morals of our world. The church can't just come along and tell you have to do A, B, or C, because you have an inner voice that allows you to engage that. So people can't take advantage of you, and that's a good thing. But what the turn inward can lead to is completely detaching or separating that inner voice from the outer voice, so that the outer voice no longer matters. The outer voice no longer has any authority in your life. The only authority in your life is the inner voice. The way that it's supposed to work is there's a critical dialogue between the inner voice and the outer voice. But the turn inward allows us to separate the two entirely. And that creates, in the moral universe, I think you all can appreciate this, it creates an enormous amount of moral instability. We like it because it gives us a sense that we can kind of self-determine and that we're engaged in the process of deciding what our lives are going to be about and how we're going to live and not going to live. But when you have 8 billion people on the planet all turning inward and listening only to their inner voice, it creates a little bit of a kind of morally unstable world to live in. The same exact thing happens with personal identity. So you go back to the ancient Greek. The way that he came to understand himself, again, right, wrong, isn't exclusively good. I just want you to understand how different it is. Someone in ancient Greece, when they engaged in the process of identity formation, understanding who they are, the way that they did that was by conforming their lives to the authorities outside of themselves. They grew up in a world that had certain customs and norms and expectations and morals and mission and values, and they just conformed their lives to that. If you asked a person in medieval Europe, the way that they came to understand who they are was by conforming themselves to the expectation of their world, in their case, predominantly the church. In each case, the authority was different, but the assumption was the same. Who I am is in many ways determined by the world in which I live. And that is a perfectly good and appropriate thing. What has happened in our world is we've made the same psychological turn inward regarding our identity that we've made regarding our morals, our permissions and prohibitions. So in our world, we almost uncritically assume entirely that who I am is not only is it not determined by my external world, it is entirely internal, and everything in my external world can be questioned, challenged, and even cast off if I feel like it's keeping me from being what I believe to be my most authentic self. Again, right or wrong. First, I just want you to understand how historically unique that is. Nobody born into, let's say, a peasant farming family in ancient Greece sat around bemoaning their station in life or feeling depressed because they could have been so much more. That was not even possible in their social imaginary. This is where the psychological turn inward is good, and it's helpful. Who I am is not restricted to or confined by, it cannot be reduced to social shaping, and that's a good thing. We all can rise above our station, which for a lot of people in human history, that was never possible. Your identity was synonymous with your social role. Because we've turned inward psychologically, that's not the case for us anymore. That's a good thing, right? That gives us a sense of freedom and participation in who we are. but it also creates the possibility of entirely detaching our inner world from our outer world. So who I am is no longer a critical dialogue between the immaterial internal self and the external, physical, moral, social world into which I live. And just like with our permissions and prohibitions, that creates an enormous amount of identity instability, which is why so many people, I think, in Western culture struggle with the question, who am I? It really isn't hard to understand. Identity requires recognition. Identity requires recognition. It is fundamentally a social phenomenon. To be a self is irrelevant if you're not being recognized as a self by other selves. And you all know this. This is why you get the phones out of your pockets and you take a picture of yourself and you put it on social media as if anybody cares what you had for lunch today. But the reason that we do that, whether we realize we're doing it or not, is because we're looking for recognition. We're looking for someone to mirror back to us, I see you. I recognize you. Or to use a word that's a lot more popular in our culture, I affirm you. I see you as you are, and I welcome you. How we think about ourselves requires recognition from the world around us. It's the only way it happens. But if identity is detached from the external world and all of the categories in the external world, if it becomes purely internal, purely immaterial, asocial, psychological, meaning there's nothing in my physical world that corresponds to it with any accuracy or trustworthiness, well, then you're the only one that gets to decide who you are. And the way that you decide who you are is by going on an internal journey that nobody else can participate in. You're the only one who gets to say and declare to the world what you've discovered by going on this journey. And the problem with that is that nobody can affirm it. Nobody can recognize it because nobody participated in it. If you want an analogy, think about language. Language is a great analogy. We receive language. We learn how to speak by listening to people in our worlds utter sounds that are initially incomprehensible to us until we begin to associate the sounds with actions, and then we start to mimic those sounds. We acquire language. We don't invent it. And only by acquiring language and conforming ourselves to the conventions of language can we actually thrive in our language worlds, which is the only world we actually live in. If a person were to say, I've been going on an internal psychological journey and I've discovered my own language, and I am demanding and expecting everyone around me to recognize my language and allow me to speak it. Everyone in your world would, by definition, not be able to do that because they would not understand anything you're saying, because they don't speak that language. See, we want to develop our own language because there's something in that feels kind of freeing and liberating until we go out into our social worlds and try to use it, and nobody understands what we're saying. And at that point, it is not fun, it's not liberating, and it's not freeing. It's very frustrating, very disorienting, and very destabilizing. You go out into the world and you try to communicate who you are, having gone on a kind of internal journey, and nobody out there can mirror back to you any kind of recognition. So you walk around feeling like nobody knows who you are, which means you don't know who you are. Because the only way you know who you are is by other people knowing who you are. This is happening for a lot of people in Western culture. One of the reasons we struggle with identity is we anchor our identity in categories that come and go, categories outside of ourselves that come and go that are not trustworthy. But another reason we struggle is because we don't anchor our identity in any categories outside of ourselves at all. We think that its identity is a project of self-discovery and self-declaration. And it's very, very destabilizing for a lot of people. The solution, I think, is the same to both sides of the equation. You need a category. You need a category that is stable. It does not change even as other categories change. But that category has to come from outside of you. It's one you have to be given, that you have to receive, and you then have to live into. And if that sounds inherently oppressive to you, that's kind of the point. The fact that we might think about conforming our lives to images or categories or standards outside of ourselves as inherently oppressive or problematic is exactly the problem. Let me give you another illustration to help. Imagine identity construction like putting together a 10,000-piece puzzle. Some of you love puzzles. Okay, imagine a 10,000-piece puzzle. What makes a 10,000-piece puzzle even remotely entertaining to consider doing? Well, yeah, Gus is like, I don't have any idea. And I'm with you, Gus. Puzzle people don't make any sense to me. I don't understand either. But imagine the prospect of putting together a 10,000-piece puzzle. The only thing that makes the prospect of that even remotely entertaining or something that you might want to engage in is because you have the pieces. Somebody gave you the pieces. Imagine someone saying, well, that's a 10,000-piece puzzle. I'm not sure where the pieces are. Good luck. If you can find them, then eventually you could probably work on that. The pieces are given to you. You have them in your hand, and those pieces correspond to a very particular picture, which you have right there on that box. You know the puzzle's going to be hard. That's what makes it entertaining. It's going to take time. It's going to be challenging. You're going to have to work at it, step back, come back to it. You're going to have to realize that you were right here and wrong there. It could take you your whole life. But what makes it worthwhile and enjoyable, and why you never find yourself going, I have no idea I have no idea what this is. I have no idea what this is about. You never experience identity crisis with a puzzle because you know that's what we're making and here are the pieces to make it. The process is just a matter of learning how to put the right pieces in the right place. Contemporary identity formation for a lot of people is like, well, that's the picture, but I don't know where the pieces are. Or it's, I'm not sure what the picture is or what the pieces are, or you got to make the pieces yourself, and I'm not really sure how to do that. Or that's the picture, but you don't have any of the right pieces, so I guess you're going to have to go fix them all. That's not fun. That becomes remarkably frustrating and enervating and soul-sapping and destabilizing. Again, there's a part of us that goes, well, I want to make my own picture. There's a part of us that feels like that's very liberating and freeing to decide for ourselves who we are. But because that is inherently impossible, it becomes very destabilizing. And a lot of people in modern Western culture are walking around with no idea who they are because they've either rooted their identity in a category that doesn't stick, it changes, it's ephemeral, or they think they can decide for themselves who they are. What really needs to happen is you need to be given a category that doesn't change, but it comes from outside of you. It's not internal, it's not self-declarative. You don't find it by going on an inner psychological journey. Someone gives it to you. And that category, I think if you were to sit and ask Jesus, he would say that category is child of God. It's child of God. Or these parents bring their kids to Jesus. Kids in Jesus' day were not highly thought of. Like we think kids are everything in our world. Like we prize youth above everything. In their day, they recognized that little kids, they don't really know much. They need adults who are wise and moral and good to teach them and govern them and lead them. Now, the downside to that is like sometimes you can treat kids like they're not important, and in their culture they did. So Jesus' disciples are like, hey, away from Jesus. He's too important for your kids. And Jesus stops them and says, no, let the kids come to me. And he says, because the subjects of the kingdom of God belong to those who are like these children. Now, on one level, what that means is to live in God's world, to live in the realm of God's reign, you got to exhibit qualities of childlikeness, things like trust and dependence and joy and wonder. That's all true. That'll preach. I think there's something more fundamental there. I think on a very basic level, Jesus is saying, the only people who live in God's reality are children. The people who occupy God's kingdom are fundamentally his kids. That is who they are, all the way down. All the way down. The way that God thinks about people is as children. Not rich or poor, male or female, slave or free, Jew or Greek, attractive or unattractive, successful in the eyes of the world or a complete abject failure, people who have marriages that are amazing and people who have marriages that are dumpster fires, people who have kids that are just rock stars and people who have kids that just screw up everything. Whatever else may or may not be true of you, I think what Jesus is saying is that the truest thing about you is that you are God's kid. All the way down. Peel all the layers back. That's who you are. That is both the category that doesn't change, even as everything changes, even as you change. I am someone's child today as I sit here as a 43-year-old man. I am still a child of somebody. I'm not the same child that I was when I was 33 or 23 or 13 or 7, but I'm still a kid of somebody. See, that category does not change, even as everything else changes. It provides that stability that we all need. But it was a category I did not self-create. Someone had to give that to me. I didn't get to decide it for myself. I didn't create myself, and I don't self-create. Our identity has to be given to it. Jesus says you got to receive the kingdom. If God creates you, one way to think about this, God creates Adam and Eve in the garden, and they get to name all the animals, but they don't get to name themselves. God gets to name them. That's God's job. If God makes you, God gets to name you. That's how it works. So if you were to go to Jesus and say, Jesus, I'm struggling with who I am and answering the who am I question, how would you help me with that? He would say, well, you need to let me tell you who you are. And I will tell you who you are. You are my son. You are my daughter. So whatever else may or may not be true of you, that's the truest thing about you. But for you to live in that, you just have to receive that by faith. You have to trust what I'm telling you. Stop trying to create your identity by rooting it in all these things that you can or cannot do. Or stop trying to think that you can just decide for yourself who you are by looking inward. Both are going to create serious instability for you. And you're not going to be able to flourish as a human person that way. So let me tell you who you are. You're my son, and now I'm going to show you what it means to be that. You're my daughter, and I'm going to show you what it means to live into that. Just like a puzzle. I'm going to give you all the pieces. I'm going to show you what the finished product looks like, and then you and me together, we're going to put the right pieces in the right places. And you will experience identity formation as a fun, sometimes challenging, sometimes frustrating, but ultimately profitable and fruitful process. You will know who you are because God tells you who you are, but you got to let God tell you who you are. We're going to finish our service this morning by taking communion together. We do this every week. If you're new to us, I want you to know that we invite everybody to come and take communion with us. If you're the kind of person, if you're sitting there this morning and you're going, you know what? I never thought about it this way, but yeah, I think I want to let Jesus tell me who I am. I think I'm tired of trying to figure out who I am by anchoring my life in all these categories that come and go. And I think it's not working with me just deciding for myself who I am. So I'm going to let God tell me who I am. If that's where you are this morning, then the table is open. Come walk with Jesus, be a part of the church, let God tell you who you are, let God show you what that looks like in your life. This is our sacrament of remembrance. We're remembering who our God is. A perfect father who loves his kid, breaks his own body and sheds his own blood. You think about what you wouldn't do for your kids, God is infinitely better than that. And we remember it every single Sunday when we take this bread and juice. But we are also participating in that. Or you take the bread and juice this morning, you're saying, okay, whatever else is true of me or not, I am God's child today. And that's who I'm going to be this week. I'm going to learn how to live that out this week. If that's what you want for your life, then come forward. I'll dismiss you in just a minute from the back row. If you haven't done this before, you'll come down the center aisle. Our communion tables are on the sides of the stage. Just take a prepackaged communion cup back to your seat using our side aisles, and then you can take that during this last song as you feel led to do that, okay? All right, I'm going to invite you to stand. Let me pray for us as we finish. God, we are grateful for your great love for us, that you call us your children, for that is what we are. We are your children. Whatever else is true of us this morning, whether we are succeeding in life or failing miserably, whether we think very highly of ourselves or not, whether our relationships are flourishing or struggling, I pray that we would receive from you by faith this morning that we are your sons and daughters, that you love us enough to come and live and die and rise, to give us your spirit that we might have full and abundant life. I pray we would anchor ourselves in that and live out of that place. We entrust ourselves to you this morning in Jesus' name. Amen.
Fall in line, 'cause if it's us and them, it's us for them, it's us for them. We reject the idol to define us anymore. 'Cause if it's us and them, it's us for them, it's us for them. Judgment be love.